Motorsport is dangerous, but back in the 1950s it was extremely dangerous, to the point where you would have questioned the sanity of anyone who got in the car. Every turn of every track could cause an accident, and any accident could easily have been your last. One driver would later remark, surviving that era of racing was not a question of skill, it was a question of luck. 1954, while Juan Manuel Fangio and Mercedes romped to the title, saw the death of Onofre Marimon at the German Grand Prix in the Nürburgring, the first time that a driver had been killed during an F1 championship event. Another F1 driver, Felice Bonetto, had been killed over the winter during a sports car race, yet however callous it may seem, the show just carried on. Deaths in motorsport were simply seen as a tragic but unavoidable, unpreventable fact of life. This led to safety being treated as basically an afterthought. Drivers didn't wear seatbelts, this flimsy thing qualified as a helmet, and barriers, forget about it, have some hay bales. That ought to stop the several hundred kilogram hunk of metal spinning wildly out of control, and definitely aren't liable to catching fire when said hunk of metal's fuel tank inevitably ruptures. For the 1955 season, it seemed we would finally get the battle we'd hoped for during the 1954 season, as Lancia and Mercedes would actually be here from race 1 this time, and Lancia would be here full time. Along with the previously signed duo of double world champion Alberto Ascari and experienced Formula Ferrari driver Luigi Vioresi, Lancia added Eugenio Castellotti, a promising 25-year-old Italian sports car racer. Mercedes, meanwhile, had retained their lineup from the previous year, while also adding Sterling Moss, who had impressed so much in privately entered Maseratis the previous year. Maserati also signed Jean Berra from the backmarkers Gordini, and two new British privateer teams would also make their debut. Van Wall had signed Mike Hawthorne from his Ferrari drive, and Peter Collins partnered with Owen Racing Organisation, which would later become the well-known privateer team BRM. 10 rounds were scheduled, excluding the Indy 500. However, Formula 1 and motorsport as a whole was about to be given a violent, gruesome reckoning, one from which it almost didn't recover. My name is Synapse, and welcome back to F1 Retrospective. As it had for the last 2 seasons, Argentina hosted the opening race of the year. First signs showed the season might be more competitive, as the top 6 in qualifying were separated by only a second. Home hero Jose Froilan Gonzalez put his Ferrari on pole. Ascari was alongside him on the front row ahead of defending champion Fangio. Jean Berra was the highest placed Maserati on his debut for the team, while Farina and Kyle Kling made up the third row. Race day was hot. Really hot. It may have been January, but that's summer in Argentina, and the race proved to be extremely taxing on all the drivers. Well, except seemingly for one. While the early part of the race involved a battle for the lead between Gonzalez, Ascari and Fangio, once the reigning champion took the lead close to the halfway point, he never looked back. Shared drives were extremely common due to the hot weather causing exhaustion, and as a result, the final results looked like this. In fact, they were apparently so convoluted that a local accounting firm had to be drafted in to help the race officials make sense of the finishing order. Curiously, the only 2 drivers to take the checked flag, having driven the whole race distance by themselves, were both Argentine drivers. But why? Well, it turns out that there was a local knowledge factor. Fangio had moved out to the country a month before the race, as well as dropping his daily water consumption to just a single litre in order to acclimatise himself to the harsh conditions. As a result, he won by over a minute ahead of 2 Ferraris, each one having been driven by 3 separate drivers over the course of the race. Although Fangio wasn't totally immune to the harsh conditions, as his leg had been constantly rubbing against the chassis of his car, which itself was being heated by both the sun and the hot exhaust system. He suffered severe burns which took 3 months for him to recover from. Fortunately, it wouldn't hurt his season, as the next race in Monaco wasn't until May, however the injuries would leave him with permanent scars for the rest of his life. During practice for the Monaco Grand Prix, Mercedes driver Hans Hermann was injured, and so Frenchman André Simon stepped in to deputise. He put his car 10th on the grid. Teammate Fangio would qualify on pole with Ascari alongside. Sterling Moss was 3rd, Eugenio Castellotti made it 2 Lancias in the top 4, with the Maseratis of Jean Berra and Roberto Mieres lining up 5th and 6th. The Mercedes of Fangio and Moss dominated the first half of the race, leading 1-2 ahead of Ascari. However, on lap 49, Fangio retired with transmission problems. This left Moss in the lead until his engine blew on lap 80, 2 lots of bad luck for the Silver Arrows. Ascari would have inherited the lead, but on the same lap that Moss retired, Ascari misjudged the entrance to the chicane as he came out of the famous Monte Carlo tunnel. He crashed through the barriers and him and his car ended up in the waters of the Monaco harbour, with Ascari having to swim to safety. This left Maurice Trintignant, in an uncompetitive Ferrari, to take his first Grand Prix victory ahead of Castellotti, Jean Berra and Cesare Paradisa, who shared a drive for 3rd place, while Farina and Luigi Vioresi rounded out the point scorers. Surprisingly, this was the first ever F1 win for a French driver. I know I wouldn't have thought it'd take 6 years for the country that literally invented motorsport to record its first win. This left Trintignant in the position of leading the driver's standings, due to Mercedes' reliability woes. However, everybody's thoughts were about to turn to something else. Following his accident and subsequent dip in the Monaco harbour, Alberto Ascari had spent the night in hospital, but ultimately suffered no major injuries. The Italian came from a racing family. His father Antonio had been a renowned Grand Prix driver of the 1920s until his untimely death during the French Grand Prix on the 26th of July 1925, shortly before Alberto's 7th birthday. His father's death contributed to Ascari's heightened awareness of safety as well as his deeply superstitious nature. He avoided black cats and unlucky numbers. He had a lucky blue helmet and racing clothes that he kept in their own briefcase that nobody but him was ever allowed to touch. And after his father's death, he vowed never to race on the 26th of any month. 4 days after his Monaco crash, Ascari travelled to Monza to watch his friend Eugenio Castellotti test a Ferrari sports car that the pair were due to drive together at the 1,000 kilometres of Monza later in the year, having been given special dispensation from Lancia to do so. The date was the 26th of May, and Ascari wasn't scheduled to drive that day, hence he had left his lucky apparel at home. Plus, it would be needlessly reckless for the safety-conscious Ascari to drive somebody else's car with no setup. And yet, when offered, he decided to drive a few laps. He set off wearing his normal street clothes and Castellotti's white helmet. As he came out from under the bridge on the third lap, the car skidded, turned on its nose and somersaulted twice. Ascari was thrown from the car and onto the track, suffering fatal injuries in the process. The reasons as to why Ascari chose to drive that day will never be known to us. Alberto Ascari won 13 Grand Prix, the same number of his father. At age 36, he was the same age as his father when he died, on the same day of the month that his father died. The corner of his accident would later be renamed in his honour, and the racing world mourned the loss of one of its greatest and most popular characters. While the wider Lancia car company was in dire financial trouble at the time, the death of their star driver can arguably be considered as the final nail in the coffin for Lancia in Formula One. Just 3 days after Ascari's funeral, the company was bailed out by the Italian government, and the F1 team, its drivers, spares, everything, was handed over to Enzo Ferrari. There was only a solitary Lancia at the Belgian Grand Prix, privately entered by Eugenio Castellotti following the withdrawal of the factory team. In his hands, he would qualify on pole by half a second. The two Mercedes of Fangio and Moss would line up second and third, ahead of Farina in fourth and Berri's Maserati in fifth. The race itself was the easiest it could be for Mercedes. Their only competition was Castellotti's Lancia, but when he retired on lap 16 with gearbox issues, the Silver Arrows were left to roar off into the distance, with Fangio leading Moss. The pair finished first and second, over a full minute and a half ahead of the Ferrari at Farina. Local driver Paul Frere would come home in fourth, while Roberto Mieres and John Barrow would split the points for their shared fifth-place finish. Fangio took over again at the top of the drivers' standings ahead of Trintignant, who was hanging on to second despite his no score. Farina moved up to third while Moss entered the top 5. Just 6 days later, however, an event would happen that would shake the world of motorsport, even more so than the recent tragedy that befell Ascari. An event so horrific that it's a minor miracle the motorsport ever recovered. As I mentioned at the end of the last episode, I feel compelled to touch on this event, as although it did not happen during an F1 event, its impact was so seismic that it would be doing a disservice to not mention it. On the 11th of June 1955, that year's 24 Hours of Le Mans got underway, probably the most famous race in Europe, if not the world. During this time, it wasn't uncommon for there to be no separation between the track and the pits, no barrier at all, just a painted line. There was also little to nothing in the way of protection for spectators. The legions of fans lining the pit straight at Le Mans were protected by just a small earthen berm, because organisers decided that would be satisfactory in stopping a ton of metal travelling at over 150 miles an hour, potentially out of control. These two shocking lacks of oversight were about to combine to cause the single greatest disaster in motorsport history. The Jaguar D-Type of Mike Hawthorne pulled over to the right-hand side of the main straight in order to enter his pit box, crossing over in front of the path of an Austin Healey being driven by Lance Macklin, who himself had pulled over to let the fast car go past. Hawthorne then began to brake to line up with his pit box, catching Macklin off guard. In order to avoid rear-ending the Jaguar, Macklin swerved back across the track, right into the path of the much faster Mercedes 300 SLR being driven by Frenchman Pierre Levegh. With nowhere to go and no time to react, Levegh ploughed into the back of Macklin at high speed, hurtling over the Austin and flying through the air. The car flew over the protective berm at approximately 125 miles an hour before careening into the crowd. The violent impact threw Levegh from the car, crushing his skull and killing him instantly. The car meanwhile disintegrated and sent debris into the crowd. Heavy components, like the front suspension, travelling at high speed killed several spectators. The red-hot engine block did likewise. The bonnet scythed through the crowd, reportedly decapitating a number of spectators. The rear of the car, containing high amounts of magnesium, burst into flames, showering people with magnesium embers. The car would burn for hours as a result of the fire marshals being unequipped to deal with magnesium fires. Macklin's Austin slammed into the unprotected pit area, running down 4 people who were all seriously injured, before rebounding across the track, narrowly avoiding several other drivers before coming to rest on the left bank. Macklin somehow survived the whole ordeal without serious injury. An official inquiry deemed that none of the drivers were responsible for the accident, instead laying the blame at the 30-year-old track design that had failed to keep up with the car's rapidly increasing speed as time had gone on. In total, 84 people, including Levegh, lost their lives and around 120 more were injured. Several European countries issued bans of motorsport entirely in the wake of the tragedy. Most were short-lasting, but Switzerland didn't lift theirs until 2018. The Le Mans disaster had an immediate effect in cutting the length of the F1 calendar. The French Grand Prix was rescheduled from July to September before later being cancelled outright. Also cancelled was the German Grand Prix at the Nürburgring, alongside the Spanish and Swiss round. The circuit at Petrobles and the Swiss circuit at Bremgarten were never used again. And as mentioned before, the Swiss enacted a ban on motorsport that lasted for over 60 years. All of this meant that there would only be 3 more races in the 1955 season. The first of these was at Zandvoort in the Netherlands, 1 week after the Le Mans disaster. With no Lancia, Mercedes had practically zero competition, and in qualifying they took a 1-2-3, with Fangio on pole ahead of Moss and Kling. Luigi Musso was the highest placed non-Mercedes in 4th, with Mike Hawthorne, one of the drivers involved in the Le Mans disaster, in 5th. During the race, the crowd was treated to spectacular displays of driving as the drivers slid their cars amongst the sand dunes that Zandvoort was built in, the track made slippery by constant drizzle. Fangio led Moss off the line, while Musso passed Kling. The 2 front-running Mercedes sped off into the distance, with Musso giving them a hard challenge, with Kling and Berra chasing further behind. On lap 21, Kling spun off into the sand and his race was over. A new challenge to the top 3 came from the Maserati of Roberto Mieres. He passed Berra, but despite setting the fastest lap, wasn't able to catch Musso. Fangio won, having led every single lap ahead of Moss, whose engine started to smoke towards the end of the race. Musso gave the Mercedes a hard challenge in an inferior machine, and Fangio was the first driver to congratulate him. Mieres finished 4th, taking the bonus point for fastest lap ahead of Castellotti in 5th, now driving for Ferrari. Stirling Moss now moved up to 2nd place in the championship, but he was still 14 points behind his teammate, meaning that the Argentine had a chance to win a 2nd consecutive title at the next round in the UK. As part of an event-sharing arrangement between the 2 venues, the British Grand Prix was moved from Silverstone to Aintree. Mercedes dominated qualifying. Moss took pole in front of his home fans, 0.2 of a second ahead of teammate Fangio. Jean Berra was the only non-Mercedes in the top 5 in 3rd, ahead of Kling and Piero Taruffi, who was making his debut for the Mercedes team. Race day was just a repeat of the day before. Mercedes dominated. Moss led home a Mercedes 1-2-3-4, narrowly winning his first Grand Prix by less than half a second ahead of Fangio. Kling completed the podium lockout while Taruffi was 4th. Luigi Musso would take the final points in his Maserati. This meant that it was the first time since the 1950 Belgian Grand Prix that no Ferrari had scored points. Fangio's 2nd place finish was enough for him to secure the title, with a round to spare, as he was now 11 points clear of Moss. Fangio was now a 3-time world champion, a feat never done before on a club that he would remain alone in until 1966. After the race, Moss and several other people thought that Fangio had let Moss win the race in front of his home fans, as evidenced by the fact that he followed him closely throughout the race but never went past. When Moss pressed his veteran teammate about the matter, Fangio denied this and insisted that Moss was simply faster that day. Perhaps that was true, but we'll never know, as this is the story that Fangio would tell for the rest of his life. 1955 saw changes made to the Monza circuit. The 2 right-handers at the end of the lap had now been reshaped into the single sweeping corner, the iconic Parabolica. Renovations to the old Monza banking had also been carried out, meaning that the combined circuit plus oval layout was to be used for the first time since 1933. Why exactly they decided to race on this absolute death trap given the year that had just happened is frankly beyond me. But a depressing pattern you'll learn in F1 is that lessons are learnt extremely slowly and are often paid in blood. Mercedes took a 1-2-3 in qualifying, with Fangio on pole ahead of Moss and Kling. Castellotti's Ferrari was fourth, while in a privately entered Lancia, 1950 champion Nino Farina lined up for what would be his final F1 race. The race itself was much like the rest of the season, a procession led by the Mercedes. Initially, Fangio led Moss, but after the Britain's engine expired just after the halfway mark, Fangio was left to lead home Piero Taruffi for a 1-2 for the Silver Arrows. Castellotti marked the end of a trying season for him with third place, while the Maseratis of Jean Berra and Argentine Carlos Mendeitgai finished fourth and fifth respectively. This result meant that Castellotti jumped up to third in the overall standings, while Fangio ended the season with a 17-point gap over his teammate Moss. In the wake of the Le Mans disaster, Mercedes, whose car had been the epicentre of the tragedy, withdrew from the all-competitive racing at the end of the season, meaning that the all-conquering W196 was gone after just 1.5 seasons and only 12 races entered. As a result, people often forget that it is one of the most dominant and successful racing cars of all time. Mercedes wouldn't return to racing for another 3 decades, and wouldn't return to F1 in any capacity until becoming an engine supplier in 1994, and eventually returning with a works team in 2010. Going into 1956, F1 was still mourning, and much was uncertain. The sport had nearly come to an end, and we had seen luminary greats lose their lives and dominant forces withdraw. It was to be a battle between Maserati and Ferrari, and we were treated to a great title battle, and one with a great story to go along with it. Until next time.